You know that feeling you get when you look at some incredible old building or a really complex piece of 19th century machinery and you just think to yourself, how did they actually do that back then? Well, what if the answer is they didn't? What if that neat, tidy timeline of history we all learned, from caves to skyscrapers, is missing a massive chapter? Today, we're diving deep into the sources behind a pretty wild theory that claims a technologically advanced global empire was literally scrubbed from our history books, the Tartarian Empire.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to build this whole idea from the ground up, starting with a single, seemingly impossible object. From there, we'll zoom out to look at the architecture all around us, then the weapons of a lost world, a supposed great reset in the 1800s, and finally we'll get to the story of the empire that was supposedly erased from history.
All right, so where does a theory about a lost global empire even begin? You'd think it would be with some ancient scroll or buried ruins, right? Nope. This whole rabbit hole can start with something way more familiar, a household item that, according to proponents, is evidence hiding in plain sight.
So this is the big question that kicks the whole thing off. Think about an old Singer or Puff machine. I mean, really picture it. Feel the weight of that thing, that cold, heavy, solid metal. Why on earth would a simple household appliance, from an era of horse-drawn carts, be engineered with the same durability and precision as military hardware? It seems off.
And this isn't just a vague, oh, it kind of looks like one. Theorists point out that the design is basically a one-to-one match in some places. They highlight how the shuttle was actually called a bullet in some of the early models. The way the needle driver moves is almost identical to a firearms striker action, and the fabric feed? It works on the exact same principle as a machine gun's cartridge belt. The argument isn't that they're just similar, it's that they share the same standard of engineering.
And all of this leads to this wild theory of conversion. The idea is that these machines were never, ever designed for sewing in the first place. They were repurposed. The materials, this armament-grade alloyed steel, was complete overkill for stitching cloth, and the cost? An entire year's salary for the average person. The theory suggests these things were built from huge stockpiles of weapon parts that were just lying around after some global catastrophe, and they were quickly adapted for civilian use to hide what they really were.
Okay, so let's zoom out. We're going from this small object in the home to the entire world around us. Because the theory argues that this exact same pattern of inherited tech isn't just in our houses, it's in the very cities we live in. The buildings we walk past every single day might be holding the biggest secrets of all.
This one sentence, this is the core of a massive part of this theory, which is often called the mud flood. The basic idea is that at some point, probably in the 19th century, some kind of cataclysm buried cities all over the world under a thick layer of mud, instantly turning what used to be grand first floors into what we now call basements.
And proponents will point to evidence that you've probably seen yourself, right? Old buildings with windows that are halfway buried at street level. Now, the official story is usually, oh, the city just built up over time. But theorists ask, does that really explain a pattern you see in cities all across the globe, all seeming to date from the same time? They claim that old photos don't actually show new construction, but mass excavation. People digging out entire cities that were already there.
And this takes the idea of repurposed structures to a whole other level. The theory says that many of the grandest buildings from the 1800s were actually inherited from this previous advanced civilization. So, a grand train station wasn't just for trains, it was an atmospheric energy hub. A church spire wasn't just decorative, it was an antenna, pulling in something called etheric energy, a kind of free energy from the atmosphere. Even those beautiful cathedral rose windows get reinterpreted as something like a magnetron or a resonator, all part of a lost science of energy.
So, if this lost civilization had this incredible energy tech, it kind of follows that they'd have advanced weapons too, right? But the theory suggests their technology was based on a completely different set of principles than ours, not on explosion and brute force, but on something way more subtle, and maybe way more powerful.
For this, theorists point to a major piece of evidence, the Tsar cannon in Moscow. Officially, it's just a ceremonial showpiece that was too huge to ever actually be used. But there's an anomaly. Restoration reports apparently found traces of mercury inside. Now, why would you ever find mercury in a gunpowder cannon? It makes zero sense. And that, they claim, is the clue that it wasn't a gunpowder weapon at all.
This all points to what theorists see as this fundamental split in technology. Our world, our technology, it runs on explosion, outward chaotic force.
They suggest the lost world of Tartaria understood implosion, an inward, focused, controlled force. So the idea is they didn't need gunpowder. They used things like atmosphere pressure and sonic resonance, vibrations that could be tuned to shatter a target. Think about those stories of Nikola Tesla and his experiments that nearly leveled a city block with just resonance. Proponents argue this wasn't science fiction, it was a lost science.
So we've seen the objects, the buildings, the weapons. The big question is, how was all of this lost? The theory argues it wasn't some gradual decline. It was a rapid, violent, and globally coordinated event in the 19th century, what they call a Great Reset that was designed to completely wipe the slate clean.
Now just look at this timeline. In the mid-1800s, within about 15 years, the entire planet is just convulsed by these incredibly devastating wars. Mainstream history books treat them all as separate events with their own local causes. But this theory asks a simple question. Is that really a coincidence? Or is it evidence of a single, undeclared world war? And then you see this number, 100 million. That's the high-end estimate for the death toll of just one of those conflicts, the Taiping Rebellion in China. Theorists argue there's just no way you get a death toll of up to 100 million people with 19th century weapons. It implies a level of destruction that doesn't point to a peasant uprising, but to a war of total extermination using hidden, advanced technology. And this brings us to the absolute core of the Great Reset hypothesis. The claim is that these weren't just traditional wars over territory or resources. Instead, this was a coordinated campaign to destroy the last holdouts of the old world, the Tartarian civilization, and to eliminate the populations that actually remembered it. According to this theory, it was a global purge, plain and simple.
So, who was this civilization that was supposedly just wiped from the face of the earth? And how could something so enormous, so widespread, be so completely hidden? This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the identity of the lost empire and the systematic methods that were supposedly used to erase it forever. Well, if you look at maps that were made before the 19th century, you'll often find this name popping up, Tartaria, or the Tartarian Empire. It usually covers this huge territory in Siberia and Central Asia. Mainstream history says, oh, that was just a vague geographical term for lands we didn't know much about. But the theory we're exploring claims it was the heart of a powerful, technologically advanced global civilization. So how do you erase an entire empire from history? Well, according to the theory, it was a multi-pronged attack. First, you rewrite all the maps and just remove the name Tartaria. You relabel all the inherited buildings, claiming your recent ancestors built them during the Industrial Revolution. You stage these huge world's fairs to show off some of the magnificent old architecture, and then you conveniently demolish it all when the fair is over. You use orchestrated great fires to clear out entire inconvenient sections of old world cities. You scatter the orphaned survivors, like with the orphan trains, to break their connection to the past. And, maybe most importantly, you suppress anyone who rediscovers the old technology.
And this is the thought that this entire theory really leaves us with. It challenges the very foundation of everything we think we know. It suggests that the buildings we admire, the technology we use, the history we read, it's all part of an elaborate story, a narrative that was constructed to conceal a past that was far grander and maybe far more tragic than we can even imagine. What if we're all just living in the ruins of a forgotten world, and we've been convinced that we built them ourselves?